And the days after George Floyd was murdered, as people of color bore the brunt of the first pandemic wave and protesters marched to demand an end to systemic racism, a group of black and brown executives in Massachusetts joined forces to try to do just that in Boston and beyond. They started the new Commonwealth Racial Equity and Social Justice Fund, which has so far raised more than $30 million, given away $3 million to organizations across the state so far. And this week, the group selected its first ever president, Makeeba McCreary, who will leave her current post as the first Chief of Learning and Community Engagement at the Museum of Fine Arts in September. To lead the fund, Makeeba McCreary joins me now. Congratulations and welcome, Makeeba.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Pretty good job at a pretty important place at the MFA. What convinced you it was a good move?
I remember seeing the same notification that they had formed their team, and I had this visceral response. I was so impressed. I was so moved. I was envious, to be honest, that they had figured out a way to put aside all of their individual positions, come together, coalesce around this huge knotty issue. And actually bring some real resources to the solve.
Can you go back a year for people who don't recall? A couple of funds were created at the same time. The fund and the city created a racial equity fund, which I didn't realize until today is actually folded into the organization you're about to run. Why was it created? What was the mission when it was formed?
I believe, and I certainly wasn't at that table, but what I was moved by was the fact that they knew that they couldn't continue to do this work individually or just as separate siloed institutions, but that it really was going to take all 19 of them to come together and put their finger right in the middle of the hole. And the focus on the idea that Black and brown leaders are assets, actually have solutions, are in need of investment so that can be lifted up, was at the cornerstone of their work.
Speaking of investments, as I mentioned at the top, already $3 million in grants have gone out, according to what I read in the Boston Globe. The grantees, I think, tell a story about what an organization is all about. Can you give us a picture of whom the leaders of the organization decided were grant worthy? Who got the money?
I have a general sense that there are organizations like Becoming a Man that is a huge part of my own personal life here in Boston, a really important organization working with young people in the Boston public schools. Mm-hmm. And I know that there also have been a lot of investments that go beyond Boston into other cities, other gateway cities across the Commonwealth that are focusing on social justice, focusing on housing, economic development, youth education.
You know, it's interesting, and I'm sure won't surprise you, the two reports that just came out of both the city and the state on healthcare equity out of the pandemic, even though the pandemic is still with us, as I'm sure you know, went way beyond healthcare to figure out how people of color, low-income people do have a level playing field. It touched on things like housing and employment issues, a whole spectrum of things. Is that sort of holistic notion about how to address this systemic problem what appears to be guiding the organization you're about to run?
Yeah, I think the pandemic really showed a light on things that were already persistently challenging for, in particularly, communities and people of color. So the Commonwealth Fund, the new Commonwealth Fund, is able to sort of say, listen, there's already an acknowledgement that the Black and brown communities are the canary in the mine. They're the ones that were already suffering from shortage of affordable housing. But when you can't leave your home because there's a pandemic, or you have to go stand in line because you need to access food in food deserts, which is where a lot of our Black and brown communities are positioned at this point, then all of a sudden you see how much more at risk that group is to being exposed to something that isn't necessarily touching other communities in the same way.
You know, I'm sure you've been asked the question 100 times already, so I'll make it 101. There are other foundations that have done wonderful work in the city with far greater assets than the fund has to date, the Barr Foundation, the Boston Foundation. When you were asked that question in the Boston Globe, you said something like the difference is we have the ability to be more nimble. What did you mean by that?
Well, I said we could be more nimble, but I also said that I see us all as being collaborative. I think that the opportunity to partner with the Barr Foundations, the Boston Foundations, the Times Foundations, these are institutions that have been established and, to your point, have very deep resources. But the new Commonwealth Fund is a startup in essence, and we're building our strategies, we're building our metrics. We are going to also be able to really hone in on a very particular set of strategies that really do speak to ending systemic racism and solving for social justice issues across the Commonwealth. That's not to say that these other foundations aren't also earmarking dollars to support those efforts. But I think that we have the blessing of being very nascent, being young, and also being able to tap into 19 different founders who cover an incredible span of expertise and area focus in their own institutions.
You know, two of the things that I think most people who read the Globe series a few years ago on racism in Boston, the first thing that most people remember is that stunning statistic from the Federal Reserve about the wealth of white families, $247,000, black families, $8, Dominican families, $0. The second thing that I remember most is the survey they did of black people and their view of how welcoming 8 American cities were. And in that survey, the least welcoming city by far, not a little, by far, was Boston. Is the notion that part of the mission, if achieved, will address that as well?
I believe that when you start talking about welcoming and inclusion, the challenge is that you don't have the right people at the table. You don't have the right decision makers, the right leaders. Or not just the right, but the right ones are the diverse ones, are the ones that give you perspectives across a spectrum of experiences. And so I think that Boston will get there, will get to a place where it earns those stripes when it has the leadership that's, raised up, that reflects the people who live here, the people who are actually experiencing this city. Until then, yeah, I think it's going to continue to be a challenge.
I wish you luck. I'm sure everybody wish you luck, and I think they're lucky to have you. Makeeba McCreary, good to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.